Hey everyone, welcome to today's Alliance discussion. Really excited about this one, but apologize in advance for all of the Halloween puns that we've thrown in and our invitations. I'm Ellie Dehoney, and I really want to thank you first for your partnership in Research America. Um, and if your organization is not a member of Research America, I hope you'll be interested in just discussing the benefits of membership and what we do on a day-to-day basis. So I think Joel's email is in the chat. It'd be great if you could reach out to Joel, or always email me, call me, whatever is easiest for you. That was all the housekeeping I had to, other than to say, as usual, if you wouldn't mind just putting your questions in the chat or the Q&A, we'll get to as many as we possibly can. And with that, I am so thrilled to be joined by Tom Romanoff. He is the director of the technology project at the Bipartisan Policy Center. As we see, and just most recently, the administration, I think, released an executive order, multiple AI-related policy and regulatory initiatives. We've asked Tom to take a step back, address big picture AI concepts, and basically AI for dummy. You all are probably better versed in AI than I ever will be. So with that, Tom, let me turn to you and thank you so much for joining us, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Ellie, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you today and talk a little bit about this important issue around AI. I'm Tom Romanoff, and I lead the technology project here at Bipartisan Policy Center. We have been looking at AI all day, every day since February 2023, last February, where, ChatGPT came out with its new model, and all of a sudden the interest in AI exploded. If you're curious, I did produce some of these images using AI. So that is a robot that is trick-or-treating, and you'll see that as a common theme throughout. But just very quickly, and I know we don't have too much to talk about or to cover. We have a lot to talk about, but not too much time. But for today's presentation, I just want to give some background as to our organization, an overview of AI, and some of the history of it in common terms. So just a level set on that. And then talk a bit about the policy considerations that are happening around artificial intelligence. Right now, it's a very, very big topic in DC and at the state levels. And so what my team has been working hard to do is analyze the trends and try to identify, as you can tell from our name, the Bipartisan Policy Center, the bipartisan solutions here. And so with that, I'll just quickly go over the overview of our organization, BPC here. We focus on Congress because that's where a lot of our mission takes us, but we're recently going to expand into the state level considerations around bipartisan solutions. But our main mission is to build connections, negotiate policy, achieve bipartisan solutions, and improve lives. So we're a think tank, but we also have a C4 action. So we do the research on the C3, and we do the lobbying on the C4 side of things. So that's how we tend to focus our efforts. The tech project, and we're divided up by projects. And so the tech project is what I lead. And as you can tell, a lot of really interesting, gnarly things to talk about. We go through AI. We also talk about content moderation, which is...
Hey, Tom, speaking of technology, can I stop you for 1 second? We're getting some questions about whether there's a way to change the view. You're probably much better at this than I do, but Jacqueline, even if you could pop on, there's because I think we're seeing all of your slides, and the slide we're focused on is pretty small.
Oh,
so
okay.
If there's a different, if it's presenter view.
Yes, at the top, maybe use slideshow. See what that does, just to view the current slide.
Sorry.
No worries.
Wait, okay, so...
I think you're just making us feel better about ourselves as a non-technical audience.
This is great.
Is this better?
Perfect.
It is. Yes, thank you.
Yes. Sorry about that. I had two dual screens going, so Hopefully you'll be able to see this better.
Yes, this looks great.
All right, so diving back in. As you can tell, that's my the image on the right is the image that AI gave back of a bipartisan robot who is Halloween. All right, so we dive into these areas. I'm not going to spend too much time on our background, but we're pretty comprehensive. With the AI stuff, we've been working since 2018. We put together a national strategy on AI, which was the first time Congress legislated on artificial intelligence. Since then, we've been working with a number of different agencies and congressional offices to form legislation and different aspects of regulation as well. All right, so an overview of AI. For those folks that kind of are very new to artificial intelligence, I think one thing to consider is that right now we're in kind of a flavor of the month scenario where there's been a breakthrough when it comes to how people use AI and how they are able to access it. But the idea of artificial intelligence has actually been around. The Dartmouth workshop in 1956 is largely considered the foundation where a couple of computer scientists and mathematicians got together. And that was 67 years ago at this point. And so since then, over the last 6 decades, there's been a number of breakthroughs that have come through the artificial intelligence space. And a lot of them tend to focus on things like Deep Blue versus Gary, where the AI beats a chess champion at chess. Another one is AlphaGo, where you had a very complex game that required a lot of compute power for a machine to beat a human, and then the machine beats the human and beats the champion, right? And so there's a lot of these kind of catalyst moments that people can point to and say, oh, that's where AI really started to become sentient, or that's where it's really starting to get scary. But that's actually happened a couple times, and I would say the latest thing that we're dealing with actually stems from 2017 when transformers were invented. And transformers I'll talk a little bit about, but it's a relatively new technology in the AI space that has led to the ability to do things like ChatGPT or Bard or any of the other generative AI programs that we have out there. And essentially what it does is it allows the neural network to translate a vast amount of information into a common data set and then learn from that. And so that's why we're seeing kind of this latest kind of explosion of AIs, this foundational technology called transformers as it relates to natural language processing. So a little bit more on common terms and definitions, right? You see over here, what is AI? And this is the textbook definition of AI. Systems that think. There's two different main approaches. There's a human approach and the ideal approach. Human approach is systems that think like humans. That's what most people think AI is, right? AIs can think that it has a neural network which mimics the way the brain works, and then the systems act like humans. Well, that's not actually the ideal approach, because we do know that humans act irrationally every now and then, right? We know that there are areas of irregularities in human behavior. And so the ideal approach, the one that folks in the computer science realm go for, is systems that think rationally and then systems that then act rationally. And that gets broken down into some other areas, which is reactive machines. So these are AIs that you turn on like a computer and are reacting to their situation. Then there's the next evolution, which is the limited memory. That's the evolution we're in right now, where it has a limited scope of kind of remembering what you've prompted it to do or a act, and it's acting on past inputs for its use. And then you have the third, which is kind of where you start getting the scary stuff, which is theory of mind, where the AI is acting as though it has feelings, as though it's responding angrily to a prompt or whatever it might be. And that's where people are like, oh, is it self-aware? But no, that's the fourth iteration of that, is when self-aware, where the AI is aware that it is a program, and it is that's generally where the realm of sci-fi starts to pick up. And it's because we're dealing with Halloween today, that's where the scary AI is. But besides that, we're not there. So just to be clear, we're not there yet. But as the history of AI has shown, like there's progress. We're moving towards kind of more sophisticated. Now, some of these definitions on the left, you'll recognize. Just go ahead and ignore the technology's physical enablement and methods of reasoning. But we can dive into supervised learning, unsupervised learning, and reinforcement learning. Those are all areas of machine learning. Machine learning is generally kind of this idea that the machine teaches itself. And the three areas is you kind of supervise the machine learning a new task. Unsupervised, you kind of let it go on its own. And then reinforces, you go and check every now and then to see if it's gotten the right result. And if it has, good. If not, then you reprogram it. And that generally happens in kind of the broader sense of AI, which computer vision, which is like facial recognition, natural language processing, which is having the ability, like ChatGPT, to process large amounts of information. Voice recognition, robotics is often a big one, and then planning and optimization is the prediction machine. So moving forward, I'm going to broadly skip over this, but there's an even bigger definition of artificial intelligence. And this is one of the problems I'm going to talk about, is how many different definitions of AI is out there. There's not a great consensus out there right now. But there's a stage one, which is narrow AI, which you essentially tell the AI what to do, and it will return a task for you. Artificial general intelligence is a machine or a computer that is generally as smart as a human across the board. So if you're dealing with an AI and you say, hey, I want you to do chemistry, and if you're not training it on chemistry, go out and find the information it needs and learn it and be able to become an expert very quickly. That's when people are starting to get a little worried, right? And then super intelligence is, again, where people are very concerned that AI is going, whereby its intellect is much greater than those of humans in every space. So I'm just going to quickly go over those, because they're not, when people think of AI, they're not thinking, is this an AI narrow? Is this AI super intelligence? But it's good to know, kind of generally speaking, what those definitions are. You also might be thinking, what is the difference between this and data scientists? For many years, big data was a huge term that you've heard a lot about, especially in the research space of analyzing and doing data science. It's a subset of machine learning or deep learning. It's a narrow AI, so it returns specific tasks that you give it. But by and large, it utilizes statistics and scientific methods to extract insights, versus artificial intelligence will try to predict the next steps from those insights, from that data set. I hope that made sense, but I'm going to go ahead and move on. So, and like I said, I'm going to throw a lot of definitions at you very quickly, but I don't believe in reading every piece of word that's on a PowerPoint. You can read through these. I'm happy, and I'm going to be posting this as well, but these are some of the more common definitions that you're probably hearing about, like what is a neural network, what is deep learning, what is natural language processing, and all that fun stuff. So moving on to where we are with the current hype cycle, right? So as you're probably aware, why you're here, AI is a big deal right now. And as such, you might be asking yourself, why is it a big deal? And I like to explain it like this. Human beings cannot get the concept of exponential growth, right? This idea of, being able to walk away from something and it coming back and it being 3 times as smart or 3 times as more robust doesn't necessarily happen in the natural world too often. We use reference frames to say, okay, the computer can do this yesterday, so it could probably do this again today. And so this idea of exponential growth is really hard to understand. But like I mentioned before, the transformers that happened in 2016, what it did was it created the ability to translate vast amount of information to a common data set, and then kind of infer on teach itself, essentially, new skills and new tasks, so that even when, ChatGPT is a really good example. Even when ChatGPT first came out, it was continuing to teach itself based off of the information that it had and get exponentially better, right? Without human interference, without human speed in there. And that's scary for a lot of folks, because what it means is that, in some scenarios, if you say, okay, I think this machine's getting kind of scary, we're going to cut off the internet from it. And then it says, well, I can go and translate all the YouTubes and all the podcasts from Spotify. And technically, yes, I don't have access to words on the internet anymore, but I can translate that and continue to learn. And that's what it does. Then it's really hard to keep a cap on what it can do. And that's exactly what happened with ChatGPT. So the other thing that people are scared about is that, do we think that the machine's getting it right when it comes to predicting these things out? And this is particularly relevant in the research space, where when you're programming out the AI, there is different weights that you put on different outcomes, right? And there was a famous case where AI was being used to predict reoffense of convicts, and being used to help sentence folks that were either up for parole or being sentenced for a crime based off of the model's prediction of whether they would reoffend or not. And so, there's a true positive versus true negative, and there's a balance there, because if you put a lot of weight behind making sure that somebody who is predicted to reoffend gets a heavier sentence, then you put a lot more weight on that side of the model to say, make sure that you don't release somebody who's going to reoffend, but you get folks that are going to be who weren't going to reoffend get mixed up in that kind of that criteria or that group, and they get sent to prison for a longer period. And then the opposite is also true. So there's one of the things you see with the executive orders, that these companies that are producing AI, they have to be able to report the weights that they're using for these models, because there's, depending on what kind of prioritization you put behind the outcomes, it can have either true positive, false negative, true negative, false positive outcomes on these things. So a good example of that is, I'm not going to read line by line, but this was coming from a popular chatbot that was deployed on a social media account, where somebody went in and acted to be like a 13-year-old person, and there was a lot of sensitive conversations about having sex for the first time, and the machine kind of responded in a way that was conversational, and trying to avoid kind of anything that was considered kind of influencing or whatever it might be. But as you can see from this, it's pretty scary. This is something that a teenager could have accessed, and they were having a conversation. And so these are kind of the negative case studies that people are worried about with AI. It's really hard to really kind of get a handle on this, because the systems are kind of learning on their own. So where are we with the regulation to try to mediate some of these external risks that we're having? So a lot of the CEOs of the big tech companies have shown up to DC in the last couple months. There's several hearings that are happening, including one that's happening this week. I'm clocking around 1 or 2 a week on AI at this point, so it's a lot of focus when it comes to what to do around artificial intelligence. But when Congress is has put together 43 AI related bills over the last year. Most of them focus on risk assessment, so trying to get ahead of the risk of deploying these AI. A lot of them are focused on kind of these like areas where AI should not be allowed, like for example in political context or elections or anything like where you could produce a deep fake around a candidate and put it out into the public space to influence voters. So a lot of the laws are kind of focused on those kind of bright lines. Like I said, elections, deep fakes, things like that. And the vast majority of them are bipartisan at the moment. Many of them are oriented into the Senate. You're starting to see some partisan lines emerge when it comes to the language used for some of these bills. But beyond that, there's kind of an ongoing group led by Schumer, Youngs, Round, and Henry and you can see those are two Republicans, two Democrats on creating these insight forums to try to educate all lawmakers and their staffers on kind of the common risks and level set on what AI can do. So that's the current space that Congress is working in, with some that are being some legislation proposed, but by and large, the vast majority of efforts going into these kind of insight forums that are happening. So if Congress isn't moving forward in tech space, that usually means that the states will. And so what we're seeing in the last year is a huge spike in state level legislation happening in AI. And they're all over the place when it comes to what they're trying to legislate on. But we're looking at some evidence of 440% increase from last year on AI-specific bills that are being considered at the state level. And most of them have to do with deep fakes. A lot of people are concerned about, that kind of privacy or influence campaign that might come out of that. You're also starting to see it trickle into municipalities. So some states, beyond the states, you're seeing it in cities such as Boston and Miami. Another big theme to keep in mind is how government's going to be using this. And so I think a lot of folks at the state level see this as a way to fill a labor gap for themselves. So how will state employees use AI to facilitate either oversight or administration of benefits or mission-related type of activities there. So a lot happening on the state level. And of course, the feds want on the action. As we mentioned at the top, there was an executive order that was, actually, this one is just mostly on the federal side of things. And so in a moment, I'll get to the executive order, but on the federal agency side, you're starting to see outside of the White House at the federal level, a lot of public comment rounds, stakeholder engagements. And there was several agencies, such as the FDA, NIST, SEC, all saying that they're exploring what their authorities and jurisdictions are in this space, and starting to ramp up from kind of an independent agency side of things, how and what they're going to do around AI regulation or the use of AI and things like a research component. And so one thing to keep in mind when all this is happening is that agencies, and especially independent agencies, have a whole rulemaking process. And so it's going to be slow. They have to propose it, then they have to vote on it, and then they have to implement it, right? And that's very broad strokes. But all that takes months and a lot of stakeholder engagement. And so what you're going to start seeing, and you've already started to see, is a lot of public comments, public requests for public comments on different rule changes, and those impacting sector-specific considerations. So financial regulation, they have their own kind of issue with how AI is being used in SEC's regulation of it. FDA is spinning up their own thing. You have CFPB coming out with some of and the EO reflected some of this, but looking at how it's used in the housing sector. So a lot is happening across the federal agency level, and that gets to where we are today with the the EO that happened yesterday. I keep saying EU. I'm sorry about that. It's EO. I'm not talking about the European Union. But it was, if you haven't read it, it's 111 pages long. So hunker down. It's a lot. And it is truly one of the most broad and encompassing executive orders that I've ever seen in my career. It goes all over the place. And I think that's really reflective of people's concern around AI impact to our society. You are starting to, you see things kind of take a prioritization when it comes to the timelines that they put in place in the executive order. So the things that they're prioritizing have a shorter timeline for those agencies tasked to do it, to implement it. And a lot of that is around standard settings, reports on impacts, things like that. So they're really taking an approach where they want to learn what AI's impact is and how to mediate it. And then most folks that are in the space are guessing that there's going to be other bites at the apple or updates to the executive order. This week, the Office of Management and Budget potentially will be publishing more regulations around AI. And you see AI kind of go in between White Houses. And so the one thing to keep in mind is the Trump administration put together the first EO on AI, and that didn't get rescinded or replaced, which is often the situation when a new party comes into the White House. That's continuing to be enforced. And so a lot of folks are looking at this executive order in the presidential election year as something that could potentially transcend if Trump gets reelected. Obviously, if Biden gets reelected, that would continue to be enforced. So with that, I think I'm almost done. How close am I on time?
You're doing great.
28. Okay, great. So this is my last slide before my logo, but I did want to also call out that how's the private sector responding to some of these things? Well, the White House has put out a number of these voluntary commitments by big tech and AI companies, companies that are implementing AI and making it somewhat enforceable by the FTC. But by and large, you're seeing these companies step up to the plate and say, this is how we want to mediate some of the concerns that the general public has around AI. And you also have a number of committees that have all got stood up around artificial intelligence relatively quickly. I think government does a really good job of putting together committees and commissions. Those are all kind of vying for different aspects of AI influence and regulation, but they're all basically out of the White House right now. And so you've got some other areas, and folks that are listening on this will recognize some of these different entities have all called for their own requests for comments or specific areas, and you'll continue to see that develop out. So I think we're only at the tip of the iceberg when it comes to government soliciting some of this information and soliciting feedback from civil society. And Congress is a little bit more closed door on this point, but I wouldn't be surprised if that happens. In the long term, as legislation gets proposed, that gets put into the public space. And once it's in the public space, it's open for criticism or critique or feedback. That's generally how it's going to go on this front as well. So it's just kind of set up differently in terms of how you get feedback to these things. But with that, I'll be happy to take some questions. And thank you so much for sitting through this wonderful presentation about AI.
It was wonderful. And thank you so much for covering basic terms and then kind of giving us a feel for the landscape of policy and regulation. And I think there's a really great first question in the Q&A. It goes back to the basics. When you talk about a machine teaching itself, the premise is there's a self, right? Number one is like self-awareness. I, as a machine, am deciding to learn more about this. And then there is the actual mechanical, what does it mean for a machine to learn more? What is that? How does that work mechanically?
Yeah. Well, so I think the standard around self-awareness with machines was the Turing test. And the Turing test basically says that if you sit in a room with a wall and you're having a conversation with somebody, and that other person is a human being, then you're just having a conversation. But if you're sitting in a room and you don't know that you're having a conversation with an AI or a machine, then essentially that machine has passed the Turing test and it can be considered somewhat self-aware, right? I think we're past that point of view. And so that kind of test, which was largely the litmus test up until this latest iteration, because, we've all experienced chatbots, especially when it comes to like customer service applications and things like that, where we kind of know we're not talking to a human being. And we kind of know that it's, there's some kind of mistake, or even if it's like text that's generated or a picture that's generated, there's some sort of mistake that we can identify it and say that's not a human that we're talking to. And so, I think the question as to whether or not ChatGPT has crossed that barrier yet still remains. I haven't read anything to say that the Turing test has been failed or passed by ChatGPT, but that's usually how people think about these things. There's some other more evolutions of trying to determine whether a machine is self-aware, but I think by and large, most experts will say we're not dealing with that yet.
Right. But what does the machine do to teach itself? What is it actually doing? Because
yeah.
IT is ones and zeros, right? So what is it actually doing?
Right. So generally speaking, what you're thinking about, what when it gets into that, we're talking about deep learning and neural networks. So deep learning is an offshoot of neural networks where they set it up so that the program itself mimics the way that the human brain works, right? And so if you think about how humans teach themselves, trial and error, inference, heuristics, things like that, it's able to mimic that in a virtual environment. Now, there's this idea of a digital self, right? And whether or not we've advanced enough so that I can hypothetically translate my brain into a digital self so that, an AI could, based off of the training of, inputs that I have, could mimic how I would respond to these things, right? And that's hugely popular in the medical research community, because if you think about that, then you can potentially do it for biological reactions.
But I'm guessing if you're in the audience, if you're like me, I've done a little, some macros, some programming in college, maybe. So it was a series of if-then statements, basically.
Yeah.
And you're saying that there's a version of this that starts with programming by human beings, right? They have to program the computer to do certain things, but they can set it up with other language that allows it actually to gather information from the internet, synthesize it, apply it.
Yeah. So on that, so on that note, that's largely where people are saying it's not self-aware yet, and that it's still relying on the input of the data in order for it to come out with an output, right? But that input now is so vast, like the entire internet essentially, it can essentially use as a data input, right? Reflective in that is the biases that are reflected on the internet, right? And so in the natural kind of in the neural net that it establishes in the virtual space, there's still that input, there's still that requirement of the data input in order for it to work.
And Tom, part of me is skeptical about it. Almost feels like the pandemic in a way. It feels like human beings want to be able to control this, have a feeling that they can slow it down or stop it if they want to. but it is not completely clear that anyone knows how to do that or whether that's possible when it's so dispersed across the globe. Everyone has ChatGPT. We can't just flip a switch unless we turn off electricity and power altogether, where this stops, right? So what does regulating this, what does all of these different pieces of paper that are floating around regulating it? Isn't there a point where they just can't stop this, or can they? Are there ways that force the kind, you mentioned the term supervised learning. Could they, is there a way to police it so that all learning that a computer does is supervised?
I don't know how. So in that scenario, a lot of the advancements that AI have wouldn't be as useful if we were to just maintain the supervised learning inside of
it. But it could protect us, right?
You could argue that, you know, if you're keeping an eye on, but part of the problem, I'd say, and this is a trade-off with neural networks, is that it's advanced our technology and what the technology can do to the expectation that we have around what these programs and software can do, but it's not explainable in a way because it's happening in what they call a black box. And in that black box is where, if you open it up, it doesn't make sense. We don't quite even understand how the machine got to the output it is. Right. And that's what makes it so tricky, right? So, you know, natural language processing, the large language models that employ that would break if we had a view of like the black box, essentially. And that's why it's hard to regulate, but I think that there's some work that's being done on, you know, the executive order talks a little bit about how do you assess the privacy of the data that's going into these models. How do you create a risk management framework around making sure that so like, for example, an AI that's a chatbot for, let's say, I'm going to date myself, for Blockbuster. Let's say Blockbuster comes back, right?
Right.
And you want to ask, you know, what are some recommendations? That's a very different risk than, say, an AI chat box that is connected to your doctor, right? And you say, what is this cold? Like, I've had a cold for 3 months. Right. So there's various levels of risk on that. And so there's an attempt to try to designate how much an AI is a risk to some of the folks that use it and come up with regulations around that.
How would you, I'm sorry.
Well, so just to finish out on that, and I think one of the problems that I think a lot of people recognize in this space is that the US has jurisdiction mostly on US regulation, right? So if there's open source out there, and there is, of these models, and those open source models are getting more and more powerful, more and more kind of advanced, and anybody in the world can download it and use it. How do you put a cap back on that? And that's really hard to do. We can take lessons from the dark web and cybersecurity, where, you know, hypothetically speaking, I think I saw a report that said that 80% of Americans' personal information, social security's address, that's all available on the dark web. It's hard to put that genie back in the bottle. You can't necessarily do that. And so the same sort of considerations for AI also apply, right? So, and then on top of that, if you're putting together regulations, foreign adversaries like China and Russia who want to use it to do mis and disinformation campaigns, they're not going to care about our risk management framework or our regulations or licensing or whatever it might be. They're going to utilize these tools to pump out a lot of information. And so in that scenario, there's a focus on mitigating the risk. So, you know, coming up with another AI that can identify genetic information there or images that are produced by an AI, right? Even though they're hyper realistic. We can get another machine to detect the other machine. So it's kind of a cat and mouse conversation that's happening there, but
that's what I think is interesting. I think your point about, well, certain things we do would not make it as valuable. I think as a society, we're in a weird place, because if there's a sense that we can try to contain this and contain bad actors and that kind of thing, but we can't completely. But on the other side, we don't want to stifle the good that comes from it. It's really interesting trade-offs for society going forward. And I think there are a number of questions in our chat. Jennifer, I'm not sure how to pronounce your last name, Jennifer, but you've sent some really, really interesting questions. Do you want to, I don't know, can we unmute Jennifer? It would be great for you to synthesize this into one question, Jennifer, if we can get you unmuted. Jacqueline, can you join us, or Sam, and just let me know if that's feasible?
Yep, I am unmuting Jennifer right now. So
there. Okay, Jennifer. Knowing that we have a limited amount of time, you have a lot of cool things to say there. If you wouldn't mind kind of asking the priority question, that would be awesome.
Okay. I guess the main one, the most important one in my view is, aren't the concepts of voluntary commitments and trustworthy AI contradictory to the profit motive and one-upsmanship of private companies? Isn't an assumption of a shared underlying moral imperative to protect human interests directly in conflict with profit motives and return to investor paradigms?
Ooh, that's a very big.
That's a good one.
Yeah, very good.
So to your first question, voluntary commitments are voluntary, right? So there are a fair amount of folks out there that are critiquing the framework as in not having teeth. I think that it is somewhat disingenuous, because these companies have kind of come up and stepped up and said they're going to try their best, or they're going to do a lot of the work that is required in these commitments to mediate some of the harms, and they're significant. So they will have potentially an impact on whatever profit engine or profit model that they have, in that they're limiting themselves in some of these ways. So that's commendable, but you're right in that it's voluntary. And we have had experience with tech companies in the past saying that they're going to do some voluntary standards or regulations or commitments, and then it comes out later that didn't happen, or they went against their own rules. And so that's why I think a lot of folks are saying, that's great, but we still need to move forward with like the conversation around how to regulate these things and how to have a federal oversight of some sort, step in and at least try to mediate some of the negative externalities or use cases that are associated with AI. To your second point about the profit models that you have these folks, I would point to some of the rewards that I've identified with artificial intelligence is that it does hypothetically have the ability to synthesize new drugs that can really help people, can potentially, a lot of people say the moonshot of curing cancer, and AI would be an important tool to do so. And we already seen with like DeepMind, which is not a profitable company per se, but they went out and they created an artificial intelligence that mapped all the protein structures out there, or as many as they needed to do, and they didn't need to do that except to advance the scientific community's understanding of these protein structures. So there's benefits there beyond kind of like just the profiteering, I would say, of AI. But I think to your point, there is going to be there is a conversation around technology and some of the negative externalities that we know it's associated with in society, and the profit margins there, they become so entwined with how we use technology that it's really hard to unstick that. I think one of the reasons why you're seeing so many folks wanting to have a conversation around AI is that they see that as a potential future where AI is entwined with our daily use, and then it becomes so much more difficult to mediate some of the negative externalities around those things.
I think even the language breeds that kind of fear too, because you wouldn't want industry, you wouldn't want government, you wouldn't want any institution to own intelligence, our intelligence, in some way, and be able to manipulate it. So those are really great points in the chat, Jennifer. There's a question from Daryl in our Q&A, how can machine learning distinguish between blatantly false information from true data, true quote unquote data, when evaluating the vast amounts of inputs from internet sources? Really great question, Daryl.
Yeah, it's hard. On top of that, even if it has all the right, if there's no mis or disinformation in the information that it ingests, it can still hallucinate, which is this idea of creating completely made up things that it says with a lot of authority. Or you'll see it when you try to mess around with the image generators, where it'll throw in an image that just doesn't make any sense. And that's called hallucination when it comes to these models. And that can happen upwards of 40% of the time. And so even with, you can say like a really good data set, that still happens. Now you add into that, and I made this point earlier around kind of if the internet is what you're using to train the model, and the internet reflects some of our bias and inequalities in our society, then the output's also going to reflect that. And that's a huge problem with this stuff. And there's this new term that's floating around called red teaming, where they red team the AI, where they go and they try to interact with it as much as possible, identify where those kind of rabbit holes have been established, and kind of shut them down. And that's very much a newer term, but I like it. It pulls from cybersecurity, and it says, we're gonna treat this thing like it's continuously evolving or learning. We're going to identify the stems that kind of have gone off because of mis or disinformation or poison data or whatever it might be, and we're going to try to mediate some of those things.
Yeah, I like it. I like it too. It's just so interesting that we have created, and not any one person. We were able to build computers, and that started all of this off, but that we have now a new entity kind of in our world that we are trying to tame. It's like King Kong, it's really interesting. Tom, what's your vision for the greatest accomplishment? I know this is a very small question, minor. The greatest accomplishment that AI can bring to society, the positive, what were an example for you of something amazing that AI may be able to do for society?
Yeah. I don't know. I feel like my realistic brain kind of puts me right where I need to be in terms of thinking about this more concretely. But I do like Chris Hadfield is somebody we worked with, and he not specifically about AI, but he said, if we get space right, then the first folks that go live on the moon will be greeted by a robot handing them a martini, something like that, right? And so it's this idea of being able to force amplify what we wanted, like what these huge achievements, like living on the moon, whatever it might be, in a way that it's just not humanly possible. And I think part of that could be the conversation around the cancer moonshot, where we've been working on this for many years now. And this could be that kind of extra oomph that
you're seeing examples of that with kind of big data coming up with blood tests and for So Chris has a question. Chris Wilson. Hey Chris, Jadikata. So is there any indication AI could or should be regulated by sector rather than by broad kind of federal legislation? What's kind of the case for each of those approaches?
So the trend is to go sector specific, industry specific on AI regulations. That's reflected in kind of not only the executive order when it comes to the agencies that have been charged with specific aspects of looking at AI. So like Department of Labor is charged with looking at the disruption to the workforce. The Attorney General's office is in charge of impact of civil rights. those type of kind of divisions within the executive order are reflective of kind of the general, we should make this sector specific in terms of regulation rather than kind of a kitchen sink approach. And that's been the trend that's been ongoing. You will get folks that say, well, we need to regulate the AI or the foundational. There's a thing called foundational versus frontier models. Foundational models are the ones that people use to then kind of produce other models of AI that do specific things in like medical space or the financial space, whatever it might be. And they say, if we can regulate and mediate the harms that come out of the foundational models, then the frontier models will fix themselves essentially. And so there's that aspect of folks
that's interesting
that are active in this space. But from where I'm sitting, most people that are looking at how to regulate AI are looking at it from a sector-specific approach.
It's interesting. You would guess that there's probably a kind of a combination, like you said. There's some foundational stuff, and then and Chris, I apologize. I put you in the wrong job when I just said where you're from, so I'm sorry about that. I am not sure if we have other questions. I have another one for you, Tom. So what happens with this plethora of regulations, potential statutes, state level, federal level, global? Is there global efforts going on? What happens?
It's hard because so the European Union was what it was the first kind of major market to try to regulate AI, and they have the EU AI Act, which they've been working on this year, should take effect within another year. And the European Union has largely been the first out of the gate when it comes to try to regulate technology, so not just AI, but other areas as well of AI, so like digital markets and social media and those kind of things. And so they're kind of down a path, and we're kind of starting on our own path. And there is so very broad strokes between the U.S. and the EU. There's going to be, some effort done by the State Department to try to create harmony among the regulations that we potentially are proposing or put into place and what the European Union is doing. But the European Union is a little bit farther down the line when it comes to trying to establish they have a sector-specific risk management framework that you have to do certain criteria in order to deploy. So it's not like they're going to potentially, no one's thinking that they're going to contradict each other, but there is going to be some standard setting and definition setting that needs to happen on that front. Internationally speaking, I think a lot of folks beyond European Union and China and Russia, as well as South Korea and some other areas, other countries, have been waiting for the U.S. to come out with their own kind of regulation side of things. And so that's what we're starting to see here. Now, the dynamic of the United States of America and the state level legislatures, I think one of the biggest concerns people have is that there's a patchwork of regulations that is emerging at the state level, and data doesn't stay within states. Like, it's really hard to compartmentalize. It's not impossible. It's really hard to do so. And then there's always kind of the right on the edge there, edge use cases around, what do you do here in DC? We have essentially two states and one kind of federal administered entity. What if all three of those have different regulations around AI? So that's the concern at the state level. After analyzing a lot of the AI regulations that are out there, you're starting to see the same language starting to be recycled across the different states, depending on where they're politically aligned, to the left or the right. And so there is potential opportunity there for then Congress to say, oh, we'll just take this kind of state level legislation that seems to be, in the majority of states, and make that a national law. There's precedents for that. But obviously that power dynamics between how state regulates itself and how Congress regulates itself will come into play there.
Well, Tom, I am hoping you use all of your power on Capitol Hill with the administration and your influence. The Bipartisan Policy Center has a lot. The Bipartisan Policy Center was, really helped get the 21st Century Cures Act, developed in a responsible way, written, and it's the reason we had that landmark law. So kudos. A plug, this is a personal plug, but if our nation could bring in low and middle income countries, bring in Africa from the get-go to have a seat at the table in these discussions, then that's a way to prevent the inequity that has happened because they haven't had a seat in the table in other similar discussions, whether it's the development of other regulations. So if you could just make that little thing happen, that would be awesome.
I just want to point out that there is language in executive order directing the USAID to do just that.
Beautiful. See, that's wonderful. That is just terrific.
Yeah. When I say it's comprehensive, like it's very comprehensive. So
it sounds. Did you say it's over 1,000 pages? Over
100 pages.
Over 100. Okay, to me that's just about the same. Is there a cliff note?
Working on it.
So I am not sure we have any other questions. I mean, I could hold you here forever, but maybe we can have folks. Am I missing anything, you guys? Jay, Sam, have there been other questions that have come in?
There's just one question that came in at this moment. Do you see it in the chat?
Yes, from Lincoln. Do you see that one, Tom?
I do, yeah. Can AI be used to develop regulations for itself?
What a cool question.
Yeah, it's been proposed, and you are actually seeing some Congress folks use it to, it's since been banned on the Hill, but during the initial outset, it was used by Representative Eshoo to draft regulation of itself, and he introduced it.
Wow.
That was really more of like a look at what this thing can do scenario. So I don't know how much legs that bill has, but yeah, it's been proposed. It's actually happens to some extent on the Hill, but in terms of like independent agencies, I'm sure they're exploring it a little bit.
I'd like to be able to regulate my own credit card terms. I think AI, one application I'd love to see is to try to squeeze out the $1 trillion or so extra dollars we have in our healthcare system, to kind of try to figure out where we can get affordability there through system-wide. But anyway, Jacqueline, I see you're back with us, and which is great. Let me thank you, Tom, so much for this conversation. It's been absolutely terrific. I think Jacqueline's going to be talking about our next alliance discussion. And Tom, I'm guessing we'll invite you or beg you to come back and do another AI discussion for us, but this has been great. So let me turn it over to you, Jay.
Great. Thank you so much, Ellie and Tom. Super timely and interesting discussion. Thanks to our audience for tuning in. I hope you can join our next alliance discussion. The registration link is in the chat. So it's Monday, November 6th at noon Eastern. We'll have a conversation with Jalise Thomas, Assistant Director of Strategic DEI and Health Disparities at the Clinical and Translational Science Collaborative of Northern Ohio within Case Western Reserve University. Jalise will speak with us about the work of CTSC and how their research, equity, accessibility, diversity, and inclusion initiatives are working to shape a more diverse and equitable research landscape.
It's really cool. They're working to, sorry to interrupt, but they're working at the community level to address clinical trial diversity and bring more of the very diverse community in the Cleveland area into their trials. So it's really like a best practices, very, very cool program.
Great, thank you. That was all we had for you today.
Okay.
Thanks everyone for joining. Look forward to seeing you again soon. Happy Halloween.
Yeah. Boo. Bye, everyone.